Senator Christopher S. Murphy, Democrat of Connecticut, said Sunday that President Biden's first television interview since his disastrous debate performance fell short of alleviating deep concerns about his age and mental acuity, and that the president has more work to do to convince voters he is fit to run for and win re-election. Voters do have questions, Mr. Murphy said on CNN's State of the Union. He added, "Personally, I love Joe Biden, and I don't know that the interview on Friday night did enough to answer those questions. This week is going to be absolutely critical. I think the president needs to do more." Mr. Murphy said he would urge Mr. Biden to do a town hall, do a press conference, show the country he is still the old Joe Biden. He avoided directly answering whether Mr. Biden should step aside, saying, "I know there are a lot of voters out there that need to be convinced that Thursday night's debate performance was a bad night." The carefully calibrated comments from Mr. Murphy were some of the first public alarm bells from the ranks of Senate Democrats who have stayed mostly silent since the debate over a week ago, but who are increasingly concerned about Mr. Biden's ability to serve as the party's nominee. It came as Representative Hakeem Jeffries of New York, the minority leader, was set to convene top House Democrats later Sunday to discuss Mr. Biden's candidacy, and at a time when a handful of members of that chamber have already publicly called on the president to step aside. Mr. Murphy's comments reflected where many Senate Democrats are landing as they head back to Washington for a critical week. They want to give Mr. Biden a little more room to prove himself or exit the race on his own terms before making any explicit call for him to do so. But they are also aware that there may be no way, at this point, to prove to voters that he is not too old for the task of defeating former President Donald J. Trump. Mr. Murphy said he thought Mr. Biden could still defeat Mr. Trump, but he added, the president needs to answer those questions that voters have. Mr. Murphy insisted multiple times during the interview that Mr. Biden had to prove himself this week in unscripted conversations with voters. "They need to see more from the president, and I hope that we see that this week," he said. The senator's message also appeared aimed at warning the president and those around him that the Defiance stance in response to real questions about Mr. Biden's candidacy cannot stand. The president has denied that a number of Democrats have called on him to step aside and declared that only divine intervention could persuade him to withdraw from the race. "There are still questions," Mr. Murphy said. "The clock is ticking." Senator Angus King, Democrat of Maine, echoed the message in a statement provided through a spokesman. Mr. King believes the president should take every opportunity in the coming days to establish his capacity to continue the campaign and the job of the presidency through unscripted interviews and direct interactions with voters, the spokesman, Matthew Felling, said on Sunday. It is only through such a public process that he can demonstrate that Thursday was simply an off night and that his past ability to define the issues and seek common-sense solutions remains undiminished. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island publicly voiced concerns last week over how candid the campaign was being about Mr. Biden's condition, but he stopped short of calling for him to step aside. And Senator Peter Welch of Vermont warned of a fierce undertow for Democratic House and Senate candidates if the Democratic presidential candidate loses badly in November. Senator Mark Warner, Democrat of Virginia, is also working to convene Democratic senators this week to discuss a path forward and their concerns about Mr. Biden remaining as the nominee. Mr. Warner has privately expressed anguish about the president's debate performance and doubts that he can remain in the race and win re-election. When Elon Musk first eyed South Texas for a new base of space operations, he promised that SpaceX would have a small, eco-friendly footprint and that the surrounding area would be left untouched. A decade later, the reality is far different. An investigation by the New York Times shows how SpaceX's ferocious growth in the area has dramatically changed the fragile landscape and has threatened the habitat that the U.S. government is charged with protecting there. More repercussions are likely coming in South Texas and in other places where SpaceX is expanding. Mr. Musk has said he hopes to one day launch his Starships, the largest rocket ever manufactured, 1,000 times a year. Executives from SpaceX declined repeated requests to comment. But Gary Henry, who until this year served as a SpaceX advisor on Pentagon launch programs, said the company was aware of concerns about SpaceX's environmental impact and was committed to addressing them. Here are 4 takeaways from our investigation. Musk used preserved lands as a buffer for SpaceX operations rocket launch sites in the U.S., such as Vandenberg Space Force Base in California and Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Typically are enormous, secure facilities with tens of thousands of acres within their confines. Mr. Musk didn't intend to buy up anything like that amount of land when he was looking at the area near Brownsville, Texas. Instead, he wanted to buy a tiny piece of property in the middle of public lands, what the team involved referred to as a donut hole. He figured the surrounding state parks and federal wildlife preserves would serve as natural buffers. But there was a wrinkle in that plan. There were several inhabited homes in Boca Chica Village, adjacent to the planned launch site, and there were frequent visitors to the state park. These people would have to be evacuated every time a launch was planned. More concerning, the planned launch site was next door to one of the most important migratory bird habitats in North America, and the nearby Boca Chica Beach serves as a breeding ground for Kemp's Ridleys, the world's most endangered species of sea turtle. Mr. Musk and SpaceX initially told local officials that the company's imprint on the region would be modest. The development would bring the area a few hundred jobs through an investment of about $50 million. Company officials also told the Federal Aviation Administration, SpaceX's chief regulator, that they plan to launch their Falcon rockets from the area. The Falcons are the company's workhorses, used primarily to launch satellites into space. Mr. Musk executed an entirely different plan. The investment into SpaceX operations, including a rocket manufacturing facility, now totals $3 billion. A second launch pad is under construction. The industrial growth has caused so much congestion along the tiny 2-lane road into Boca Chica that some of the now 300 SpaceX employees and contract employees get to work by hovercraft. SpaceX also began testing Starship, a rocket that dwarfs the largest version of the Falcon and weighs nearly 4 times as much. As test flights began for the Starship, Mr. Musk hailed the advance as a step toward someday sending manned spaceflight to Mars. The FAA initially wasn't expecting operations of this scale or a rocket of this power. Officials with the U.S. National Park Service also grew frustrated with SpaceX's failed promises. The company agreed to certain conditions to limit the impact on the nearby Palmito Ranch battlefield, site of the last Civil War fight. But one Park Service official, who has since retired, told The Times that SpaceX violated several of those agreements. "We were being misled," the official, Mark Spire, said. In April 2023, SpaceX executed its first full-scale test launch of a Starship. But the rocket malfunctioned, and a self-destruct mechanism eventually caused it to explode. Steel sheets, concrete chunks, and shrapnel were hurled thousands of feet into the air, then slammed into the bird habitat, as well as onto the nearby state park and beach. One concrete piece was found too, 680 feet from the launch site, far outside the zone where the F.A. had thought damage could occur. That was neither the first time nor the last that the protected areas were pelted with debris. On at least 19 occasions since 2019, SpaceX tests of Starship rockets or prototypes caused fires, leaks, explosions, or other problems associated with the rapid growth of Mr. Musk's complex in Boca Chica, which he calls Starbase. Even the hovercraft that employees used to commute created what officials at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife described in a letter to SpaceX as new hazards to a globally important shorebird area. The environment took a back seat to SpaceX's and America's ambitions. Mr. Musk exploited the limitations and competing missions of the various agencies most poised to be a check on Starbase's expansion. Those charged with protecting the area's cultural and natural resources, particularly officials from the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Park Service, repeatedly lost out to more powerful agencies, including the FAA, whose goals are intertwined with Mr. Musk's. The United States already depends heavily on SpaceX to launch its defense and commercial satellites into space. The Defense Department and NASA both intend to fly cargo aboard the new Starship. NASA has a $9 billion contract to use the rocket to land astronauts on the moon for the first time in more than 50 years. The FAA is charged with fostering space travel safely, and even though it is required to do an environmental study of SpaceX's operations, the agency acknowledges that protecting the environment is not its first priority. Blowing debris into state parks or national land is not what we prescribed, But the bottom line is no one got hurt, no one got injured, said Kevin Coleman, the top FAA official overseeing space launch licenses. We certainly don't want people to feel like they're bulldozed. But it's a really important operation that SpaceX is conducting down there. It is really important to our civilian space program. President Biden will continue his efforts to rescue his imperiled re-election effort on Sunday, with 2 campaign stops in Pennsylvania, a key swing state. Mr. Biden will visit Philadelphia and then Harrisburg, as a growing number of Democrats from across the party's ideological spectrum are calling for him to drop out of the race over concerns about his age and mental sharpness. Pennsylvania is one of the states that Mr. Biden almost certainly must win if he hopes to retain the White House. And its largest city, Philadelphia, is one of his favorite places to campaign. But former President Donald J. Trump has pulled ahead in the state in many polls. Mr. Biden won Pennsylvania in 2020, but Mr. Trump now leads the president by about 3 percentage points, according to a 538 polling average. Gavin Newsom of California, a top Biden surrogate, spent Friday and Saturday campaigning for the president in western Pennsylvania and Bucks County, a hotly contested battleground. Mr. Biden had been expected to speak at a meeting of the National Education Association in Philadelphia on Sunday, but he pulled out after the powerful education union staff went on strike. He will instead deliver an address at a church service in Northwest Philadelphia on Sunday morning. President Biden is a fierce supporter of unions, and he won't cross a picket line, Lauren Heat, a Biden campaign spokeswoman, said in a statement. After Philadelphia, Mr. Biden will travel to Harrisburg for a community organizing event with union members on Sunday afternoon. His campaign said he would be joined throughout the day by Gov. Josh Shapiro and Pennsylvania's 2 senators, Bob Casey and John Fetterman, both Democrats. Since a poor debate performance where he frequently lost his train of thought, Mr. Biden has largely stuck to delivering prepared remarks from a teleprompter. Without the device, he has sometimes struggled to speak clearly. This week, he stumbled over his words during 2 radio interviews, even though his aides had provided the hosts with the questions, a practice that goes against standard journalistic ethics. And he gave several confusing answers during an interview with ABC News on Friday. Even Mr. Biden's allies have said that his campaign should ensure that he appears more in public without a teleprompter to demonstrate his mental sharpness. They don't need scripted remarks, said Steve Sisolak, the former Democratic governor of Nevada, who supports Mr. Biden. He needs to show people that he can do it on the spot and answer questions, tough questions, and be out there with voters. Be out there, mingle with your folks. Despite doubts from many Democrats, Mr. Biden has defiantly insisted that he will stay in the race. On Friday, the president told ABC News that only the Lord Almighty could force him to drop out. You were wrong about 2020. You were wrong about 2022. We were going to get wiped out. Remember the red wave, he said, referring to an expected wave of Republican gains that never materialized in the midterm elections. Instead, Democrats did far better than expected, a decisive factor in Mr. Biden's decision to run for a second term. He took that spirit with him into a 22-minute ABC interview with George Stephanopoulos on Friday, in which he was asked about his approval rating of 36%. Well, I don't believe that's my approval rating, Mr. Biden said. That's not what our polls show. In an effort to turn out his supporters, the president is scheduled to attend several campaign events in Pennsylvania with the First Lady on Sunday. The comeback kid mythology that Mr. Biden has built over a half-century in politics is colliding with a new reality, where he is not being held up as a fighter who overcomes obstacles, but is accused by his critics of putting his own ego ahead of the country. His denial of polls, voter concerns, and growing calls among Democrats for him to leave the race have left some in his party with a quandary about how aggressively to try to persuade him to change course, with time running short to make a change. For Mr. Biden, the phrase "when you get knocked down, you get back up" is not simply a campaign ad. It is a key to understanding how he views himself. He sees himself as the scrappy, average Joe politician who has been constantly overlooked, underestimated, and counted out. To him, the naysayers are as necessary to his story as the supporters. And he does have supporters who say they still believe in him, including Gov. Gavin Newsom, a Democrat of California who visited a Biden campaign office in Pittsburgh on Friday to boost morale among volunteers in a crucial state. But even Mr. Newsom, who has been full-throated with his support since the moment Mr. Biden exited the debate stage 10 days ago, was clear about the stakes. This is a really important week and weekend. None of us are naive about the pivot after that debate. Campaign officials said before the debate that Mr. Biden's performance, good or bad, would not cause polls to crater. This was always going to be a close race, said Kevin Munoz, a campaign spokesman, and the dynamics at play are the ones we've long anticipated. Voters continue to be deeply concerned by Donald Trump and his harmful agenda. And the more we engage and reach out to voters, the more they support President Biden. On Saturday, Mr. Biden joined a call with a group of senior campaign surrogates and spent an hour and 15 minutes soliciting their feedback about the past few days. Senator Chris Coons of Delaware, a longtime Biden ally, said everyone on the call encouraged him to stay in the race, but also relayed that supporters had a range of concerns about his ability to keep the job for another 4 years. He asked us to share, who have you heard from, who is critical or has a concern or isn't persuaded? Mr. Coons said. Mr. Biden told the group that he understood the concerns and wanted to do more interviews and unscripted appearances in the future. Kate Bedingfield, who served as White House Communications Director until 2023, said Mr. Biden would still need to prove himself in the days ahead. I think this is a very competitive race, but I also think that there's no question that he has a lot of work to do here, Ms. Bedingfield said. This is a moment where he really needs to show people that he is all in it for the reasons that I know he's in it, which is to protect democracy and defeat Donald Trump and push back on the threat that he poses to our country. The ABC interview was supposed to be one opportunity for him to do that. He didn't succeed. David Axelrod, a veteran strategist and alumnus of the Obama administration, wrote in an opinion essay on Saturday. People close to Mr. Biden felt differently, that he'd done enough to continue fighting an establishment that shows signs of turning against him. On Saturday, Mr. Biden huddled with family at his home in Wilmington, Delaware, and attended church with his sister, Valerie Biden Owens. His family has urged him to stay in the fight more often than not. Last week, the Bidens gathered at Camp David, where again, their message was the same: stay in. The family is still urging Mr. Biden to stay the course, according to people familiar with their thinking. Jill Biden, the First Lady, has traveled the country to campaign in recent days. Hunter Biden, Mr. Biden's son, is pushing for his father to stay in the race. According to a half-dozen people familiar with the Biden family dynamics, Mr. Biden may be fielding advice from allies and placing calls to Democrats on Capitol Hill in an effort to keep the dam from breaking against him. But they say his decisions in the coming days and weeks will be heavily influenced by his family. Democrats have expressed distress in recent days that Mr. Biden's family could have so much control over his political future. People who know the family, however, say it has always been this way. Mr. Biden recounted in his memoir, Promises to Keep, that when he was considering dropping out of the presidential primary race amid a plagiarism scandal in 1987, his two sons, Beau and Hunter, caught him in the hallway at home. The pair pleaded with him to stay in the race. They feared how much he might change if he was not running to prove himself and to show the world who he was. The only thing that's important is your honor, Hunter, who was in his teens, told his father at the time. That's what you've always taught us. Your honor. You'll change, Dad, warned his son, Beau, who died in 2015. You'll never be the same. Mr. Biden eventually left that race, but these are different circumstances. Beau Biden is gone, and it is a loss that has both gutted Mr. Biden and guided his presidency. Hunter Biden has been convicted of 3 felony gun charges, and his ongoing legal problems are said to be a major personal weight on the president. On top of that, Mr. Biden is now an 81-year-old incumbent, and Democrats closest to him still privately fear what would happen if anyone but him is on the ticket against Mr. Trump. Mr. Biden has been adamant that his debate showing was a one-off and says he wants to debate Mr. Trump again. He told Mr. Stephanopoulos to watch as American allies descend on Washington next week for a NATO meeting, where he will work to shore up relations and deliver a news conference. Come listen, Mr. Biden beckoned his interviewer forecasting the widespread support that he has always believed has been his due. See what they say. Donald Trump has never shown much interest in grooming successors. When he left as host of The Apprentice, he mocked the ratings of his replacement. Number alumni network exists for former Trump White House staff members in the way there does for the two presidents who preceded him. He signaled his approval when supporters chanted, "Hang Mike Pence," during the Capitol riot on Jan. 6, 2021, a former aide testified to Congress. But a funny thing has happened on the way to naming a running mate, with an increasingly theatrical selection process focused on a wide field of candidates. Akin to reality TV, the former president has fostered a new crop of rising stars inside his party. The group under consideration already constitutes some of the most coveted pro-Trump Republicans for cable news interviews, and their access to some of the party's biggest donors has widened thanks to their newly burnished Trump bona fides. Whoever is not chosen as the Republican vice presidential nominee undoubtedly will be among the first names discussed for the top of the ticket in 2028. Representatives Byron Donalds of Florida, 45, and Elise Stefanik of New York, 40, along with Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio, 39, are widely viewed as some of the party's most promising young stars. Senator Marco Rubio's conservative credentials have been polished by Mr. Trump's consideration of the Florida senator as a top contender. Gov. Doug Burgum of North Dakota has emerged from political obscurity to become one of the former president's staunchest defenders on television. Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina has gotten more exposure from being mentioned as a possible running mate than he did during his own presidential bid this year. Vivek Ramaswamy, an Ohio businessman, would most likely have faded into the background after ending his own White House bid, but he has been kept in the mix at campaign events and fundraisers at Mr. Trump's insistence. "Trump has been enormously helpful to these people," said Newt Gingrich, a former House Speaker who Mr. Trump considered as a running mate in 2016. "They are all bigger and better known than they would have been without Donald Trump." Mr. Trump has helped raise their profiles by repeatedly praising them at rallies, mentioning them as possible running mates. His campaign has also created an apparatus tailored toward that aim. An internal booking team is explicitly tasked with making sure contenders are booked for cable news interviews and quoted in conservative media outlets. The campaign team has also helped contenders organize pro-Trump fundraisers and provided them call lists with specific donors to ask for contributions for the Trump campaign, which could also help them in the future. But the contenders also bring benefits for Mr. Trump. In recent years, some of the party's most visible pro-Trump voices have also been some of the most controversial public figures, such as Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia, who was stripped of committee assignments in 2021 after endorsing the executions of Democrats and spreading dangerous and bigoted misinformation, and some on the conservative fringe, like Mike Lindell, the chief executive of Mipolo, who has been a leading financial supporter of Mr. Trump's election denial movement. Republicans like Mr. Vance, Mr. Rubio, and Mr. Burgum all have records of pointed criticism of Mr. Trump, but are now among his most vigorous defenders. By shedding their reservations about him and participating in the vice presidential selection process, they have made Mr. Trump more appealing to more traditional Republican voters and donors, while also demonstrating his total dominance of the party. They have also become a credible army of pro-Trump, largely establishment voices for television interviews and at fundraisers. After Mr. Trump makes his pick, the rest of this group will remain seasoned surrogates for the campaign as the election approaches. Mark McKinnon, a longtime advisor to Republican presidential candidates, said that Mr. Trump had been wise not to focus on well-known figures from his Make America Great Again movement, which he said would have excited his base, but not helped attract new voters. The interesting thing about what appears to be Trump's short list are the dogs that aren't barking. No MAGA celebrities, Mr. McKinnon said, adding that it was good for Trump short-term electorally, but also good for the party because it broadens the appeal. Mr. Trump has long insisted that whoever he chooses should be ready to take over from him in the Oval Office if necessary. "We have a lot of good people that we're looking at," Mr. Trump said in an interview on Newsmax in June when asked about his running mate. "But the most important thing, and I've said this quite a bit, and I guess a lot of people would say it, is if something should happen, something bad I guess it would have to be, but if something should happen, we have to have somebody that can step right in and do a great job as president." The former president has also appeared interested in floating as many names as possible to increase speculation, but which has also, in turn, raised the profile for those Republicans. In one example, Mr. Trump gave an interview on Fox News in February in which he was asked about 6 politicians: Mr. Donalds, Mr. Ramaswamy, Mr. Scott, Gov. Ron DeSantis of Florida, former Representative Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii, and Gov. Kristi Noem of South Dakota, and whether they were all on his short list of running mates. Those 6 names were not all on his short list, according to people familiar with the running mate search, but Mr. Trump confirmed they all were contenders. That moment signaled to his aides that he was interested both in suggesting the search was wider than it was and in helping elevate the profiles of his Republican allies. Mr. Trump, in many ways, owed this to fellow Republicans. His out-of-nowhere presidential bid in 2016 has often been referred to as a hostile takeover of the party. But little consideration has been given to the impact of one of the key elements of that campaign, which was to effectively undermine what had been widely regarded as a deep and promising group of conservatives. Bobby Jindal and Scott Walker, 2 young Republican governors who were seen at the time as the future of the party, ended their presidential bids before the first 2016 primary contest as Mr. Trump commandeered attention from the news media and Republican voters. Since then, both have been relegated to the sidelines. Before launching their own 2016 bids, Senator Ted Cruz of Texas had been hailed as the next great conservative hope by National Review, and Senator Ron Paul of Kentucky was tabbed as the most interesting man in politics on the cover of Time. Both ultimately returned to the Senate, where they are known now more as key Trump allies instead of Republican wunderkinds. After Mr. Trump eviscerated the campaign of Jeb Bush, marking the end of a decades-long run of Bush family dominance in Republican politics, many observers wondered where the party would go next. The Republican Party has a deep and talented bench, as demonstrated by the strength and diversity of the leaders who support President Donald J. Trump, said Michael Whatley, the chairman of the Republican National Committee. Officials in President Biden's Treasury Department have proposed new actions aimed at crippling a fleet of aging oil tankers that are helping deliver Russian oil to buyers around the world in defiance of Western sanctions. Their effort is aimed at punishing Russia, but it has stalled amid White House concerns over how it would affect energy prices ahead of the November election. In an attempt to drain Russia of money needed to continue fighting its war in Ukraine, the United States and its allies have imposed penalties and taken other novel steps to limit how much Moscow earns from selling oil abroad. But Russia has increasingly found ways around those limits, raising pressure on the Biden administration to tighten its enforcement efforts. Treasury officials want to do that, in part, by targeting a so-called shadow fleet of oil tankers that is allowing Russia to sell oil above a $60 per barrel price cap that the United States and its allies imposed in 2022. That cap was intended to restrict Moscow's ability to profit from its energy exports while allowing its oil to continue flowing on international markets to prevent a global price shock. But Russia has largely circumvented the cap, allowing it to reap huge profits to fund its war efforts. While Treasury officials want to knock Russian tankers out of commission, economic advisors inside the White House worrying that would risk inflaming oil prices this summer and push up U.S. gasoline prices, which could hurt Mr. Biden's re-election campaign. They have not signed off on the proposals, even as current and former Treasury officials present them, with analysts suggesting the risks of a major effect on the oil market are low. The debate reflects a tension that has always been at the core of the administration's novel effort to restrict Russian oil sales, how to weaken the Moscow war machine without the political backlash that could come from inflicting pain on American drivers. The dispute is a rare public instance of internal administration disagreement over inflation and Ukraine policy. It pits Treasury officials against aides on the White House National Economic Council, which is led by Lael Brainerd. White House officials privately described the process as routine and stressed that no decisions have been made. But the delays have confounded officials elsewhere in the administration who have been unable to get a straight answer from Ms. Brainerd and her team about what is holding up the proposed action. For now, according to multiple people familiar with the discussions, who spoke on condition of anonymity because they were not authorized to speak publicly, the proposed penalties on the Russian shadow fleet remain under review and are not imminent. Ms. Brainerd declined to speak on the record about the process. White House officials refused to answer direct questions about oil price concerns and the Treasury proposal. Instead, the White House issued a statement from Amos Hochstein, a senior advisor to Mr. Biden. Our actions to enforce energy sanctions are focused on exacting a price on Russia, Iran, and other bad actors while preventing a spike in the price of energy, which would not only hurt American consumers but increase the revenues of the same bad actors we are trying to hold accountable, he said. The White House is under pressure from inside and outside the administration to do more to enforce the oil price cap, which Treasury Secretary Janet L. Yellen and her team drew up to years ago in the months after Russia invaded Ukraine. After the invasion, the United States and Europe moved to ban imports of Russian oil in an effort to reduce revenues for one of the world's largest oil producers. But Ms. Yellen and other leaders of wealthy democracies against Russia's invasion realized that the European ban, when fully implemented, risked knocking millions of barrels of oil off the global market and triggering a price shock that could send gasoline as high as $7 per gallon in the United States. Their alternative plan was to use the maritime industry, including shipping companies and insurance carriers, to effectively allow Russia to only sell oil at a discount, $60 per barrel, which is about $25 a barrel less than the price on the global market. The so-called price cap proved successfully initially, but Russia soon found workarounds, including delivering oil to buyers via a group of aging Sovcomfort tankers operating without Western insurance. That has come to be known as the Shadow Fleet. The fleet of tankers, along with alternative forms of maritime insurance, have allowed the Kremlin to continue generating robust revenues from oil exports, helping it to finance its war against Ukraine. Critics of the price cap have argued that the $60 per barrel limit is too high and that the Biden administration has been too lenient in certain aspects of enforcing the cap. Some have called for the Treasury Department to impose more stringent oil sanctions on Russia akin to those on Iran's oil sector. In an interview with the New York Times last month, Ms. Yellen defended the price cap, arguing that Russia's work to circumvent its still imposed costs and made it harder for Russia to sell its oil. We've made it very expensive for Russia to ship this oil to China and India in terms of acquiring a shadow fleet and providing insurance, Ms. Yellen said. We still think it's working. Still, current and former Treasury officials want the administration to go further and target the shadow fleet tankers with specific penalties that could restrict their sales or force them out of commission. European officials moved last month to penalize Russian ships evading sanctions by carrying liquefied natural gas to market, an effort that could be complemented by Treasury's proposal for oil tankers. Treasury officials have privately produced and circulated an economic analysis that contends, based on a history of enforcement actions under the price cap, that the proposed shadow fleet penalties would be unlikely to knock Russian oil off the market and would instead force Moscow back to selling much of its oil for lower prices under the cap. Robin Brooks, a senior fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution, and former top Treasury official Ben Harris, who is now Vice President and Director of the Economic Studies Program at Brookings, released a similar analysis publicly late last month. It argues that historical evidence suggests efforts to shut down shadow fleet tankers are unlikely to have even a modest impact on global oil prices. 20 shadow fleet tankers are currently under sanction out of a fleet of about 120. Mr. Brooks and Mr. Harris write that the administration could penalize the additional 100 tankers in waves in order to minimize price disruptions. They chart evidence from previous enforcement actions to show none of them have had large impacts on the oil market. While this is far from causal, we think it validates the notion that further sanctions on the Sovcomfort fleet are unlikely to cause oil price spikes, Mr. Brooks and Mr. Harris write. White House officials have recently argued that the price cap and related enforcement measures has thus far hurt Russia, but not American drivers. Energy analysts, and even Russian officials themselves, have linked our increased enforcement activities to the increased discount on Russian oil. At the same time, Russian export volumes have remained high, avoiding the price spike that many feared in 2022, Dalip Singh, a deputy national security advisor for international economics, said at Brookings in late May.